ゃないんですか。
In the years after the war, the Japanese people shared one national goal: to catch up with the West. Now they've achieved their goal, and the way the world sees Japan and the Japanese see their own role in the world is changing fast. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, where the Japanese attacked the US fleet and brought America into the Second World War.
1,102 men lie entombed in the wreckage. They represent every rank in the United States Navy, from apprentice seaman to rear admiral. The men considered officially buried at sea, and the Arizona lost in action.
For today's Japanese visitors, Pearl Harbor is a somber reminder of the changes in their own lives and in their country's reputation in less than 50 years. Pearl Harbor was the high point of Japan's wartime aggression. It was followed by humiliating defeat and poverty. Now the Japanese are back with an affluence they never dreamt of. Hawaii is now the most popular foreign destination for the Japanese. The number going abroad rose 500% in the last 5 years to 10 million. By spending their yen, they were doing their national duty. The government has encouraged overseas travel to help reduce Japan's balance of payment surplus. Japan's new wealth was made by its dynamic industries: steel, cars, electronics. They outstripped the world in the 1970s and 80s, and as they did so, the yen rose in value against other currencies. Today, the Japanese people have the highest per capita GNP in the world. With 2% of the world population, they have 12% of the trade. A new generation has grown up which has known only prosperity.
6,750,000, 7 million.
In the 1980s, before the recent drop in the value of stocks and other assets, wealthy Japanese collectors inflated prices on the world art market.
All right, lot number 24. And what should we say to start this now? $25 million to start it. At $25 million for it now, $25 million now.
They paid record sums for impressionists.
At $25 million for it, $26 million, $27 million now.
Japan has become the first economic superpower, its strength resting on industrial competitiveness, not military might. In the past 10 years, the center of world financial power shifted across the Pacific. Japan became the world's largest creditor nation. 8 out of 10 of the world's biggest banks are Japanese. Tokyo securities houses, each with its own trading floor, vie with one another to invest the high savings of ordinary Japanese in Japan's own companies. They move capital all over the world through a global communications network that keeps them in close touch with other markets. Early evening, New York. As Wall Street is just closing, Sanyo Securities' New York office reports into the next morning's meeting at Tokyo headquarters. Business is down with the recent fall in the market, but the fundamentals are strong. Japan's economy is still growing at between 4 and 5% a year. Though the yen has fallen recently, it's risen 78% against other major currencies over a 10-year period.
There has been a 40% decline in the Japanese stock market, but I believe this decline in the value of Japanese shares is temporary. I think the long-term trend will be that share values will keep rising. The private financial assets of the Japanese already exceed $7,000 billion, and they'll continue to grow at nearly $800 billion a year. But there aren't enough places to invest these funds within Japan anymore, and so people are looking for opportunities to invest abroad.
Half of Japan's overseas investments have been going to the United States.
ロサンゼルスの中心部の高層ビルはほとんどが日本の所有である。買う物件がなくなった今、日本企業は自ら高層ビルを建設し、ビル経営に乗り出している。
In 1 year, the Japanese bought $13 billion worth of property in the United States alone. They took a major stake in New York's Rockefeller Center, and they also bought 2 Hollywood film studios. The American reaction surprised them.
コロンビア買収に関してニューズウィーク紙はソニーがアメリカの魂を買ったようなものと報じたことに見られるように、一部マスコミはこの買収を日本企業のアメリカ進出の象徴的な出来事と捉え、センセーショナルに伝えています。
And the Japanese have also moved into another part of America's heartland, Big Sky country, the American West.
This ranch is the first breeding ranch to be bought by a Japanese company. Japanese investment in land, especially agricultural land, has increased greatly. And not all Americans have good feelings towards the Japanese. It's a small town near here, so one of my most important jobs is to present a good image of the Japanese here.
"6,000 miles away, Japan's own agricultural heartland lies in the rice paddies of Niigata Prefecture. Each spring, school children are taken to the fields by the older people of the village to be taught the traditional method of planting rice by hand that sustained the Japanese for thousands of years. Although most planting is by machine these days, this is a deliberate lesson in values and hard work. It's designed to pass on to the children the age-old view that the Japanese people have had of themselves.
Look at this map of the world, please. This is Japan. It's a small island country surrounded on all sides by sea. Japan has very few of its own natural resources, and so it imports resources from other countries. When we say we import natural resources, we mean that we buy them and bring them home.
What they teach is we are a small nation, lots of people to feed, no natural resources. This means that you have to borrow money to buy raw materials, add value, and export. The difference in price is going to give you the money to buy food. Therefore, those who don't work to add value shall not eat. So that's sort of the raison d'etre of this country. And if you are taught like this, you keep exporting and hope that you earn money and then you eat well. That is the Japanism. And everything we do is related to this notion.
It's a trade war in which the weapons aren't guns but sanctions and tariffs. Mr. Nakasone arrived at the White House.
For the Japanese, the alliance with the United States has been the keystone of foreign policy since the war. Militarism was replaced by mercantilism. Japan could put all its efforts into industry and economic expansion, while America shouldered its commitments as the world's policeman. Under this shield, the basic Japanism was irrepressible. The Japanese people added value to and exported far more goods than they imported. By the 1980s, their very success had become their greatest problem. It led to growing trade friction with their closest ally and largest markets.
When Japanese current account surplus reached the level of a few $1 billion a year around the middle of the 80s, we started to worry that it has become a little bit excessive. And in 1987, it hit the historic high of $87 billion a year. And at that time, this amount represented almost 4% of our total GNP. And we thought that was quite a problem.
Though the trade surplus grew, most Japanese continued to think of themselves as a small nation which had to keep exporting feverishly in order to survive. Yasuhiro Nakasone became Prime Minister in 1982.
私は日本が戦後史の大きな転換点に立っていることをひしひしと感じます。今こそ戦前戦後の歴史の中から後の世代のために何を残し何を改むべきか、そして我々はどこに向かって進むべきかを真剣に学び取り、新しい前進のための指針とすべきであると思います。世界における我が国の役割を対極的に考えるとき、世界に開かれた日本の認識に立って我が国の立場のみにとらわれることなく、世界全体の調和を図っていくことがひいては我が国益にそういう縁でもあるのであります。
政府は深刻化する貿易摩擦問題に対処するために総合的な対外
Facing foreign pressure, Nakasone tried to get the Japanese to understand their country's economic dilemma. He appealed to the public directly.
まず第一は貿易は拡大均衡でなければいけないということであります。つまり萎縮して貿易が小さくなっていくんではいけない。そしてパネルを
I held a press conference in which I appealed to the people to buy $100 worth of imported goods. You could say I was asking people to overcome their tendency to buy goods labeled made in Japan and instead to buy good products regardless of where they came from.
一人$100買いなさいっていうのは
The $100 I asked them to spend was merely a symbolic amount. You might say that it stood for an internationally oriented Japan.
手を結べ輸入で世界の国々と中曽根総理大臣が乗客に呼びかけているこのポスター、東京大阪の主な路線に10万枚貼ったという政府としては異例のキャンペーンなんです。
いやこんなのがポスターになるんだなと思いましたけど、
外国製品を買いましょうということが書いてありますが、
買いたくありませんね。高いですね。
あ、そうですか。
高いです。高い。
But the surplus remained. Japan's trade partners weren't convinced there'd been a real change of heart. Trade negotiations dragged on. At first, the problem was tariffs, but as they were gradually removed, imports still didn't rise. Other countries, as well as America, complained that their own economies were wide open to Japanese goods and investment, but it seemed the whole Japanese system was tilted against foreign goods coming in the opposite direction. Successive US trade negotiators talked tough to Japan and tried to get the so-called structural impediments removed.
Now, we simply cannot have open and free trade if the first largest market in the world is only to be absorbing goods and the second largest market in the world refuses to permit both investment and trade.
In the 1990 talks, the Japanese were pressed to change a long list of domestic business practices that kept out imports or kept prices high. The Americans attacked the Japanese banking system, inefficient distribution, and the way small shopkeepers could veto large retailers setting up to compete with them.
The American way of doing business by their rules doesn't have universal validity. The Americans make a big mistake about this. What I want to ask is whoever dreamt up the crazy idea that the American way of doing things should conquer the world.
The most emotive issue of all has been rice. Even when the tariffs on other agricultural products are being removed, Japan steadfastly blocks all foreign rice imports. With its highly subsidized farmers and small paddy fields, the price of homegrown rice is 6 to 7 times the world level. Other Asian countries and the Americans argue that since they buy Japan's industrial products, the Japanese should at least buy their cheap food.
It's always been our staple food. We couldn't live without it. If our situation ever became really difficult, we couldn't rely on other countries to feed us. It's natural that we should want to be able to live on what we can grow at home. If we weren't able to, all we could do then would be to go into the mountains and eat leaves, and that would be hopeless. That happened often enough at the time of the Second World War.
Japan's farmers, a powerful special interest group, want to keep protection. Though the Japanese government defended its stand on rice, they've blamed other American failures to get into the Japanese market on the Americans themselves. They've argued the American system must change too.
We have been advising our American friends to increase their savings, either by fiscal stimulus or some monetary measures, or by some educational efforts. At the same time, we have been advising them to enhance the international competitiveness of their export products.
Okay, I read the research. You know what I think? I think America's getting an inferiority complex about Japan. Everything from Japan.
The friendly advice has not been welcomed by American businesses. A new wave of television commercials reflects the current American fear of Japan and a new hostility.
And people prefer the Japanese version.
Imagine a few years from now, it's December, and the whole family's going to see the big Christmas tree in Hirohito Center. Go ahead, keep buying Japanese cars.
When
Mr. Morita of Sony buys Columbia, there's a fuss. When Mitsubishi buys Rockefeller Center, there's a big fuss. When an Australian buys 20th Century Fox, there's no fuss at all. Isn't there something odd about the way these issues are or aren't made into problems? As the New York Times said, this must be racism. I believe that in order to create a healthier, free world economy, we need to tackle this problem of racism and get rid of it. This is necessary for the sake of America and for the rest of the world.
The relationship is under greater strain than ever before, and a new analysis of Japan and what's gone wrong is being heard.
さてこの番組では月曜日からさまざまな角度で日米関係についてお伝えしております。そしてこの1年間にわかに日本に対する海外からの見方が変わってきております。リビジョニスト、修正主義者という人方たちが日本一論ということを表しているからだと思います。今日はそのリビジョニストの代表的なお一人でオランダのジャーナリストカルフ・フォン・ウォーフレンさんにスタジオに来ていただきました。
In their books and articles, the revisionists say the West has been too tolerant and has been wrong to think the Japanese share the same values or political ideals.
In Japan, there is nobody who is ultimately in charge. This is one of the major themes in my book, that there is in Japan no place, as Harry Truman would have said, where the buck stops. There is no person, no group of people, no institution that has the mandate to decide in emergencies, that has the mandate to carry out a policy and stick to this policy. Because there are so many groups in Japan that share power, and none of these groups has given this kind of mandate to anyone amongst them. The Japanese Prime Minister does not begin to have the kind of power that Prime Ministers have in Europe or that the President has in the United States.
My view is that Japan has a very different idea of what the purpose of an economy is, how to run an economy, how to organize it, and a very different idea about the relationship of government to its citizens. That's not to say that the Japanese view of this is wrong or in some way unfair. but it is to say that it's quite different. So in a nutshell, my view is that there are two teams. One team's playing football, the other team's playing baseball. The Americans keep telling themselves that both teams are playing baseball. As long as they keep telling themselves that both teams are playing baseball, they won't be able to deal adequately with the team that's really playing football.
If the U.S. remains, quote, soft, unquote, towards Japan on trade, there will be an inevitable escalation of friction, as there would be any place in the world, about the continuing unbalance of the economic relationship. The way to preserve the political structure that is so valued in the rest of Asia is to find ways to regulate the trade.
The revisionists are making a mistake. I've read their books to see what they're about, and all I can say is that their observations about Japan are extremely superficial. Their understanding of the issues of race, of the Japanese character, of our traditions, and much more is extremely inadequate. And they confuse these questions of national character with Japan's economic activity.
The Japanese backlash is represented by The Japan That Can Say No, the controversial bestseller whose co-author is Shintaro Ishihara.
Up to now, Japan's relationship with America has been like that between elder and younger brother, one of subordination and dependency. America has paid lip service to the idea that Japan was an equal partner, when the reality was quite different. Indeed, the Americans didn't believe Japan was equal. The time has now come for America to rethink its attitude and to think of Japan as a truly equal partner, and that would be in America's own interest. When I was in Washington, I met Congressman Gephardt, a ringleader of the Japan bashers there. I said to him, "You're right to point out that Japan-American relations are vital, not just for our two countries, but for the world. You could say we're like a married couple, but who's the husband?" He couldn't answer. So I said, "I suppose we'd have to say that America is the husband and Japan is the wife. That's fine. But if that's true, we want to be a proper wife, not just a mistress who can be thrown out as soon as she says no."
When Japan looks in the other direction, towards Asia, memories of the war still dominate relations. In Tokyo, a special museum and shrine commemorate Japan's war dead. There's an engine from the Thai-Burma Railway built with the forced labor of Asians and Allied prisoners. The militarist period and the 15-year war which began in China are remembered clearly by the older Japanese. But the younger generation knows little of what happened.
There are stories about Japanese students at a women's university who had no idea that Japan had gone to war with America and had been defeated. This may sound like a joke, but it's not. In general, young people know almost nothing about these issues or about Japan's wars in Manchuria, China, and other parts of Asia during Hirohito's reign.
Japan's Asian neighbors complain that the textbooks used in Japanese schools haven't given the full story of Japan's aggression.
Instead of the word invaded, as in Japan invaded China or Japan invaded Asia, textbooks use the phrase advanced into. And at Nanking in 1937, there was undeniably a huge massacre, but that gets described as a large number of people died.
The president of Korea, Chun Do-hwan, was invited for a visit to Tokyo in 1984 to improve relations with the country which had colonized and exploited his people between 1900 and 1945. The late Emperor Hirohito referred to the sensitivities of the past at a state banquet, but the words he used amounted to a bland understatement.
長い歴史にわたり、両国は深い隣人関係にあったのであります。このような間柄にもかかわらず、今世紀の一時期において、両国の間に不幸な過去が 損したことは誠に遺憾であり、ご一行
6 years later, the new emperor, Akihito, had to make a stronger and more honest apology.
絶えません。
In Singapore, Japan has been the leading foreign investor for the past 5 years. But memories of the war live on.
I think if there were an international psychiatrist that advises nations instead of individuals, they could have advised Japan, get it over with. If you get it off your chest and tell your neighbors, look, we did wrong and we are sorry, and we won't do it again, that clears the air. But this bashfulness, this pretense that it was all a misunderstanding, a slight misunderstanding, and let's not mention it, that leaves a residue of suspicion that there was no real regret, no remorse, and it could well happen again.
Southeast Asia has become the fastest growing area for Japanese direct investment. Malaysia is the latest country to benefit, as Thailand did before. Last year, Japanese firms opened 60 factories in Malaysia, far outpacing the Americans and the Europeans. This is Japan's backyard. With higher costs at home, Japanese companies have rushed in to take advantage of lower land prices and lower wages. They're welcome because they bring jobs, high technology and training. To some, it seems as if the Japanese are now achieving the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere they aspired to in the past. But this time, it's by peaceful means, not force.
There emerges some perceptions in the countries in Southeast Asia that Japan is now an empire. And I think that we just cannot rule out the possibility that Japan again will dominate that scene in the same pattern as we saw in the 50 years ago. But I do not think that Japan will make the same mistake again.
The rest of Asia fears Japanese domination of manufacturing and finance. But there's a separate criticism of the Japanese by environmentalists in Asia and the West. Japan is the world's largest importer of tropical timber, making disproportionate demands on the remaining rainforests. More than half of Japan's hardwood comes from the Malaysian states of Sarawak and Sabah. In the last 30 years, the rainforests of the Philippines, Thailand and Indonesia have been decimated. Sarawak has not long to go if the present rate of cutting continues.
Kamu ada parang, saya pun ada parang. Kamu pun ada sinapang, saya pun ada sinapang. Kamu mati, buang. Kami tidak mau.
The immediate victims are the tribal peoples. With the game in the forest gone, they've lost their main source of food.
Hutan kami.
Years of logging, much of it for Japanese firms, have brought soil erosion, silted rivers and floods.
If you look at Japanese society, apart from disposable chopsticks, you have a whole culture which is into wasting, which is into consuming too much, which is into drinking too much, which is into eating too much. We feel that the logging issue is also related to that. Only Japan can consume so much wood for one country. The very expensive, precious hardwood from Sarawak and Sabah that takes hundreds of years to grow is used in extremely wasteful manners in Japan. This precious wood is put together in very thickly for casting cement. After the cement is cast, the wood is burned. And this sheer waste of very expensive rare commodity.
Environmentalists also accuse the Japanese of plundering the seas and taking more than their share of the world's fish. Japan uses 30% of the tuna caught and 40% of the shrimps. Under international pressure, they finally agreed to stop commercial whaling. but some continues for what are called research purposes. Campaigns on these issues have little popular support in Japan. Naoko Kakuta started the first local branch of Greenpeace. It has a mere 200 members.
Japan certainly imports great quantities of all sorts of resources, marine produce, timber and many others. We Japanese think this is a problem for the supplying country, for the exporter, not for the buyer. We don't have any sense that there's anything wrong with buying in such vast quantities. Japanese people just think, well, that's the world economy for you. That's what economics is all about. Economics is still strongly at the center of Japanese thinking. We think that if we've made a proper commercial deal and paid good money, then we haven't done anything wrong by doing the deal. We still haven't learned to look at it from the perspective that we must protect the environment and preserve resources. In other words, we haven't learned to judge it from a moral standpoint, to decide about whether our activities are actually wrong or right.
These youth have come to this new world directly under the equator to search for their dreams and ideals.
The Japanese are trying to counter the charge of selfishness. Young volunteers now go to third world countries in the equivalent of voluntary service overseas or the Peace Corps, giving technical assistance or working as teachers. And Japan has taken over from the United States as the largest foreign aid provider.
We wanted to become a more prosperous society as far as we were able. That was our priority. Now we've achieved that. So now we must set new priorities. At home, we still want to improve our infrastructure. Abroad, we want to learn what kind of a contribution we can make to international development aid and aid to debtor countries. Those are our new priorities.
Young people from Japan are leaving their comfortable lives and jobs behind to strike root in developing countries. Burning with the enthusiasm of youth, they joined local people in their nation building, offering their skills and knowledge.
When I was in office, we gave out $10 billion a year for overseas development assistance, far surpassing the United States. In the last 5 years, we've also given $50 billion for financial recycling.
The Japanese yardstick for giving foreign aid is extremely short range, and it's tied to business interests. I think we're extremely clumsy at it. We don't understand the rules. In Japan, we talk about nari-kin, what you call nouveau riche. When people suddenly become very rich, they want to play like rich people. But there are major problems in this.
A changed place in the world is putting Japan's traditional homogeneity to new tests.
In Japan, we have a kind of candy bar for children called a kintaro. It's been around since the old days. Wherever you cut it along its length, you get the same face. I think we need to change this kintaro bar, which is Japan. I believe this intense degree of homogeneity will be one of the big issues in Japan from now on. I wonder whether it's not becoming a weak point. The question of whether Japan is different from other countries often gets debated. But the fact that there isn't much debate within Japan makes us a rather different country from other countries.
Japanese are told from the time they go to school and watch television and read newspapers that the Japanese people are unique. Not just unique in the sense that all people are unique, but somehow uniquely unique. Somehow so very different from other people that other people cannot possibly understand exactly how it is to be a Japanese.
What I want to point out is that there are all sorts of civilizations in the world: Islamic, Chinese, and lots of others. And I really doubt you can put Japan alongside these other civilizations and still claim that we're unique, somehow uniquely unique. I think that way of looking at Japan just mythologizes us. Of course, I can understand why they do it. They take the developed countries of Europe and America as the norm, and from that standpoint, Japan certainly is unique.
Hi there. Hi there. Welcome to Tower Bridge. Naruhodo, the world.
Cut off on their islands, the Japanese have had little direct contact with the rest of the world. Quiz programs like Naruhodo the World or So This Is the World get large audiences, entertaining viewers with the strange things foreigners get up to.
大勢の人たちが集まっています。すごいたくさんいるな。さて、ここで問題です。実はこの人たち、あるものを見るために集まっているんですが、さて、それは一体何でしょうか。
サラブレッドでね、ポロかなんかやってるんじゃないかなと思ってるんですけどね。それはまさきね。はい。
羊レースとか。
羊ってのはレースやりました。あ、どうした？
何？
狐狩りかな。当たりなんだ。どうして？また入れ替わり。本当。その通り。なぜかあれは狐狩りでございます。ご覧ください。
狐狩りを見に来てるんです。フォックスハンティングは馬が60頭、犬が37匹だそうです。そして犬が離され、いよいよスタートです。この狐狩りに参加できるのは貴族か大地主といった大金持ちだけで、彼らはシーズン中の10月から3月までほとんど仕事をせずに毎日のように狐狩りに出かけるんです。
日本という国は世界の中でWe understand in our heads that Japan must not remain an isolated country, but Japanese people really don't understand on an individual level what that really means. That's because we have no experience of living side by side with other races.
Internationalization has become a political slogan, though no one's quite sure what it means. On one level, foreign fashions and tastes are being adopted quickly.
And shoe.
一品目はスモークサーモンを使った冷たいオードブルで。
The Tsuji Culinary Institute in Osaka teaches the finer points of French cuisine with meticulous care and accuracy.
プチレギュームの入ったドレッシングで召し上がっていただきます。Alors messieurs, table numéro 6. 4 couverts, 2 petits de légumes, 2 tartares de saumon, ensuite 2 coq au vin.
Japan has been going through a gourmet boom. The school owns 2 chateaux in France and has trained 30,000 chefs who go on to staff new French restaurants opening up around Japan.
We don't just take in foreign customs in Japan. First we adapt them to suit us better, then we adopt them. So I suppose we do take in foreign influences, but then, in my opinion, we change them. For the moment, we're absorbing the culture of different countries around the world. I believe that after a certain point, someone will come along who will make us pay attention to Japanese culture again. Then I think we'll start to respect our own culture, and it'll carry on from there.
To the citizens of Tokamachi, the spirit of internationalization means a street festival devoted to Japanese-Italian brotherhood. Italian diplomats have come 200 miles from Tokyo to help the kimono-weaving town celebrate a twinning up with Como on the Italian lakes.
非常にこう純粋培養されたような文化で。
It's a culture that has undergone very pure cultivation, as it were.
言ってみればすごい綺麗な空気を自分たちだけが吸って、
It's as if we Japanese have been cultivated in very pure air under a glass dome.
日本人は生きていると、そこへガラス
And there is this mentality that were the glass to break, germs might get in and we would be unable to survive.
というようなね、もうメンタリティがそういう感じで。
Refugees are now crossing from China and Vietnam. Their arrival has dramatized the debate about homogeneity and internationalization and exposed the fears of many Japanese. The authorities detain the boat people because Japanese law bars unskilled immigrants. But despite this, small factories employ a growing number of workers from elsewhere in Asia who've entered the country legally as tourists or students, but stay on to work illegally. With a labour shortage in Japan, the immigrants do hot and dirty jobs in small workshops or on construction sites. The number of illegals is now over 100,000. They see Japan as an economic paradise.
In 17 months, I saved $20,000 or $21,000 US dollar. So it's enough, really. And I will work here more 3 years or 4 years. I am a rich man. Of course, naturally. So I will back country, buy a big house or a car and start well-established business. And after that, a beautiful girl married. So you have a money, you married every beautiful girl.
Small employers like Mr. Kaiichi Udagawa argue they need the labourers badly to do the work the Japanese won't do.
中小企業の小さなそういうところへは
The Japanese workers don't look for jobs at small or medium-sized businesses, especially not the small ones. And so, when the foreigners come here, we want them to make up that shortfall. So it's mutually beneficial. We help them, and they help us.
お互いに持ちつ持たれつ、助けられたり助けたりでちょうどいい。
When I look at the Pakistanis, working just like the hungry Japanese of old, I think to myself, these people are just like the Japanese used to be.
働いてるパキスタン人を見ますとですね、この人たちが
And I think if the Japanese were to follow the example of the Pakistanis, perhaps we would get back to our old Japanese ways.
日本人に帰ってもらいたいと思いまして。
もし日本が現在のまま
If Japan were to go ahead as it is now and admit foreign workers in the same numbers as, for example, France and Germany, that would amount to about 7% of the population, which would in Japan's case mean about 10 million people. Perhaps 7 million of them would gather in the Tokyo area, and in all probability, unimaginable chaos and confusion would ensue. A number of classes or castes would develop below the Japanese population. There would be all sorts of trouble. In fact, the phony refugees who arrived in Japan last year from Vietnam and China are already engaged in factional struggles within their internment camps here. And we are also now witnessing struggles and murders between Pakistanis and Bangladeshis, and especially the emergence of secret societies with bosses at their heads. Even with very small numbers of people, these things are already happening.
يا أيها الذين آمنوا أنفقوا مما رزقناكم من قبل أن يأتي يوم لا بيع فيه ولا خلة ولا شفاعة.
Most come from Pakistan, Bangladesh and the Philippines.
الله لا إله إلا هو الحي القيوم لا تأخذه سنة.
They have no legal protection or medical cover, and they live in cramped quarters. They do not feel welcome.
Last week, I visited a child school in Japan, a small kindergarten, and when I just stopped over it, the student of the school said, Gaiko cousin, abonai desu kara. That means are the foreigners, danger, danger. Oh, my foreigners, danger, danger.
I want to ask this nation, this government authorities or this nation, what type of society they have here. These are something different from the rest of the world.
وسع كرسيه السماوات والأرض ولا يؤوده حفظهما.
I believe that we should let some foreign labor into the country, under proper regulations. We should set yearly quotas of 100 or 150,000, but then send them back within 2 to 3 years and have new people sent over. Whilst here, they should be properly registered and should get social welfare and medical care, and their problems should be dealt with in the same way as Japanese people. In that sense, it would be very educational for us.
Japan's rise has reshuffled the world economic order, and coming just as the Cold War was ending, the balance of political power and influence has shifted too. Many of the great problems facing the world leaders are economic, not ideological. With third world debt, the US deficit, and the near collapse of the Soviet economy, Japan is in a special position. She's the world's richest nation and the greatest source of capital. Japan's leaders are taking a more assertive line. Prime Minister Kaifu makes frequent forays abroad. He's been to Eastern Europe. He's taken a more independent line towards the Soviet Union and China. But a basic paradox remains. Japan needs peace for its own trade to flourish, yet it still relies on others to ensure this. When it regained independence in 1951, Japan agreed to the continuation of US bases. 40 years later, the idea that they're there to defend Japan against Russia is wearing thin. But the world's largest creditor nation is still relying on the world's largest debtor nation to keep the peace. Today, 50,000 Americans are stationed on the unsinkable aircraft carrier, and the Japanese contribute to their upkeep. The security treaty is still the foundation of Japanese foreign policy.
The Japan-US Security Treaty is on the surface about security, but at a deeper level I think it's about the fact that Japan and America share a common set of values. Because we share these common values, whether or not there is peace in the world, the values will remain the same. I can't really imagine Japan-US relations deviating from this common ground.
Up until now, Japan has given the impression of just being subordinate to America. Whatever America has said, we would just say yes, yes, and jump to attention. Because we've wanted to be on good terms with America, our relations with the Soviet Union have remained sour, and we've neglected North Korea and China out of regard for America's feelings. Well, we must now say goodbye to all that.
In theory, Japan has no army. In the peace constitution imposed by the Americans after 1946, Japan renounced the right ever to go to war and declared that land, sea and air forces would never be maintained. In a pragmatic adjustment in the Cold War, Japan established the self-defense forces. With 1,200 tanks and 160 ships, Japan now has the third largest defense budget in the world. But there are severe restrictions as to how they can be used.
It does appear as though Japan's defense spending has recently increased, but in truth, half of that is pay, and only half of it goes towards training costs and equipment and so on. And that equipment is absolutely limited to that which is necessary for protecting Japan. For example, we have no long-range bombers. We don't have large aircraft carriers with which we could attack other nations. The maximum range of Japan's missiles is 200 kilometers, and we don't have anything with which we could reach another country. So, to put it in soccer terms, all our effort goes into the goalkeeper.
The seizure of Kuwait pointed up the limits of Japan's role as a major power.
29日朝のバグダッドの新聞です。ご覧のようにサダム・フセイン大統領が外国人人質と会ったという記事が一面トップで大きく伝えられています。
Saddam Hussein manipulated the Japanese hostages and their families he kept in Baghdad. But despite a professed wish to share the burden with the Americans, Japan was paralyzed when it came to doing anything to help. Japan has more to lose than any other major power. 70% of its oil comes from the Middle East. Its economy depends on uninterrupted world trade. But Japan did not join the international operation. Her constitution prevents the dispatch of forces overseas. Japan's leaders contributed money, as they did during the Gulf War of the 1980s, but they felt severely embarrassed and wanted to do more.
我が国が国際社会の中でより大きな地位を占めるようになればなるほど、平和を守るための責任は重くなり、我が国自身その自覚に立ってより一層の貢献を求められます。
Japan dispatched just 17 doctors in the early weeks. They were given an official send-off while the government looked for a way of contributing a real military force. They tried to circumvent the constitution with a special law that would allow Japan to join UN-led peacekeeping operations, but it was defeated. The opposition argued that even this would frighten the neighbors and could lead to a militarist revival.
If we were to use all our technology and our money and our policy of always putting peace first, there's a lot that we could do to benefit the whole world. I mean, what do we honestly think we can achieve by dispatching the self-defense forces to the Gulf? There are much more important things that we could be doing. So if the present debate spurs us into thinking seriously about what Japan must and mustn't do, then I believe it'll turn out to be a blessing in disguise.
Whether Japan keeps its lead in the future will depend on its technology, and she's now moving beyond cars and electronics into aerospace, the one industry in which she's still behind. Up until now, Japan has bought its planes from America or built them under license. Its first rocket, the H1, which launches small satellites, was built with American help.
13、12、11、10、9、
This is 全システム完了しました。
7、6、5、4、3、2、
1、エンジンスタート。0。
They are now trying to develop their own advanced aircraft. The H2 next-generation rocket is being built and developed by Japanese engineers alone. The Japanese continue to advance into areas that were once the preserve of others. At 6:30 in the morning, their yachtsmen trained for an assault on a trophy long held by the Americans, the prestigious America's Cup. The challenge is being mounted by the Nippon Ocean Racing Club. 30 of Japan's largest companies have paid for the new high-tech boat built in Japan. They'll compete in 1992 at San Diego.
We invited foreign coaches over from abroad and trained with them. And I gradually realized that they weren't superstars and that we had a chance of overtaking them. And now we've all reached the stage where we're going all out to win.
The millionaire's sport is a long way from the simple frugality of old Japan, but the perseverance and discipline they bring to it will be the same. The Japanese are proud of their achievements and confident of their manufacturing expertise, but they still feel insecure, forever debating whether wealth has brought true happiness, worrying whether they will slow down. As the Cold War ends, they know the certainties of the last 40 years are gone. They are cutting the ties which bind them to the United States, but there's no consensus about what comes next.
If you consider that Japan picked itself up from the ruins at the end of the war and built itself into an economic power of this scale, then I certainly think we've succeeded. If I had to explain our economic success and great potential, I would say the reason lies in our unique system of Japanese-style capitalism overlaid on our unique Japanese culture. This is very different to the European and American practice. For example, the way technology is dealt with by management, or the ways in which management deals with human relations. These things are, to say the least, completely different from America. I think that's the secret of Japan's success.
The Japanese still have far to go in order to improve the day-to-day standard of living of the people. Because they've become a bit more prosperous, they feel proud and think that the Japanese way is better and that Japanese management is superior. They've developed a strange kind of arrogance. There is also a somewhat unhealthy form of nationalism.
And the young people born into this society know nothing about the hardship of their parents' generation. They take this prosperity for granted.
貧しい間はね、日本も貧しい国でしたから。In
our poverty, because we were a poor country, there was a certain set of morals that went hand in hand with our poverty, and we were very familiar with that. Now we're rich, but we still haven't learned a new set of morals to suit our affluence. We'll have to learn one, but it's a matter of trial and error.
その間にいろいろトライアンドエラーがあると思いますね。ヌーボーリッシュだって言って批判されたらいろんなことがあると思うんで。
In the meantime, we've been criticized for being nouveau riche.
その人に愛される。
We still have to learn to be the kind of prosperous country that can endear itself to others. But we have a long, long way to go.
日本が優秀だから日本は良くなったんじゃないんです。
It's not because Japan is superior that we have recovered. It's thanks to the fact that free trade prevails in the world that Japan's situation has improved. Japan has no natural resources. We're a poor country, but we have a hungry spirit, and we work hard.
If you haven't sampled it yet, and you don't mind the crowds, then why not give the Christmas market a whirl?